Welcome to the show. The story of Roanoke, as told to you in school, ultimately ends in a mystery with some very compelling theories. But the beginning of the story takes place years before the tale you were told and far away from the shores of North Carolina today. This story of Roanoke will have a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is the story of the first colony of Roanoke. In the 16th century, the English Empire was hardly an empire at all. Outside of its brutal efforts to subdue Ireland and assimilate Wales, England had yet to spread her influence in the fashion of the Spanish or the Portuguese. And it seemed unlikely that such a small kingdom would ever eclipse giants such as these. This was the time before the unification with Scotland. There was no United Kingdom. Greatness, from anyone's vantage point at the time, had yet to even appear on the horizon. It would be a group of men from the extreme southwestern edge of England, known to historians as the West Countrymen, who would peer out into the transatlantic world and see possibilities. Chief among them was Sir Humphrey Gilbert. A veteran of the occupation of Ireland, in 1577, he developed a massive plan to formally take possession of Newfoundland and plunder the Spanish possessions far to the south, using the profits gained to grind his way through the Caribbean. Each success would fund the next, a very ambitious plan. In 1578, Queen Elizabeth approved his plan and awarded him the exclusive rights to settle North America in the name of the Kingdom of England, the first of any such charter ever issued by England for the continent. In this agreement, Queen Elizabeth granted all English settlers the same rights they would have in England. Such would be a precedent that here would set up later revolutions. Gilbert recruited as many as 500 men, acquired 7 or 11 ships, depending on the source, and left England in 1579, well supplied to explore and settle a colony. However, this attempt floundered for reasons not completely known. We do know that there were contrary winds and wayward captains that made up at least part of the problem. Ultimately, nothing was accomplished, and Sir Gilbert drained his own finances and that of his extended family in the process. But in this failed attempt, he came to employ a Portuguese man by the name of Simon Fernandez, who had great knowledge of the Spanish and Portuguese possessions in the New World. This was a time when geographical information about the world had value. Clandestine details were opportunities for a would-be privateer or colonizer. Fernandez possessed a wealth of knowledge, and all of it was for sale. This made him the bane of the Iberian monarchs, but a gift to the English. Gilbert kept Fernandez employed despite his own dire straits, which had recovered a bit by 1582. This is when Sir Gilbert risked everything on his newest scheme for colonization. He sold all of his properties in the London area and established the Newfoundland Company. Furthermore, he gained investors in this company by selling estates in unspecified, yet-to-be-explored lands. He sold somewhere in the vicinity of 8.5 million shares of acres to individuals, including many wealthy Catholics, seeking to become lords over lands still within the English domain, but in the periphery of the realm, where they could establish their order outside of the Anglican sphere. Such land sale schemes would be considered fraud today, but were actually not uncommon for the era. Sir Gilbert, in an elaboration of his earlier plan, decided to take Newfoundland and control the licensing of the fisheries there. Then he would plant his investors and their colonists in an area the English referred to as Norumbega, a vague and variously applied term to larger and smaller chunks of the northeastern United States and parts of Canada today. From here, his company would have a base to plunder Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, and then the company would become solvent, and the English Empire would now have subjects settled in North America. To spearhead this effort, Sir Gilbert sailed to Newfoundland to formally claim the island for England. Here, the fishermen had long lived in fishing camps, English being the only one of many ethnicities found among the fishermen. Sir Gilbert had the fisheries here come to submit to his authority. He made a formal claim for the Kingdom of England, he instituted a tax, and then he sailed for home. but he never made it. His ship went down to the depths. All hands were lost. This is where the story will start tilting towards Roanoke, I promise. Sir Humphrey Gilbert's charter now fell to his half-brother, Walter Raleigh, soon to be Sir Walter Raleigh. 17 years younger than his brother, he grew up idolizing Sir Gilbert and participating in many of his brother's endeavors. Raleigh had a great resemblance to his half-brother, and as a young man, he was a well-built, 6-foot-tall individual in the 16th century. Needless to say, Queen Elizabeth took an eye to him during the winter of 1581, causing much intrigue and speculation, further fueled by her habit of giving him titles and new revenue streams. He would now have his brother's charter, but the Queen forbid him from actually leaving England in pursuit of a colony in person. Afraid that he would face the same fate as his brother, Raleigh would have to be content to realize his brother's dream without ever seeing it. He devoured the few books written about the earlier colony of French Florida, brutally destroyed by the Spanish, and was intrigued by the rumor of gold and silver high in the mountains of Appalachia. Licensing fishermen off Newfoundland was a low-reward chasing game for Raleigh, and for most of us, if we're being honest. Pursuing gold is far more desirable than cod. The most detailed account was written by a French Huguenot by the name of Jacques Lemoyne, who just happened to live in England. Raleigh would consult with the man, and one of the many legacies of French Florida is that it not only spurned on Spanish Florida, but its few survivors enticed the English to the North American mainland. Raleigh concluded his new colony should be far south of Newfoundland, but north of the former French colony, and thus a safer distance from the Spanish. At the same time, this colony, if well hidden, could be a base for English privateers to plunder the Spanish settlements and the Spanish treasure fleet. Raleigh, only a month and 2 days into securing his brother's charter, sent 2 ships out to explore the east coast of North America in April of 1584. With a crew of about 75 men, his brother's former employee, Simon Fernandez, I hope I'm saying that right, would serve as pilot. Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, who will continue in our story, so it's important to know them now, would serve as captains. They would come to rest off the shores of what today we would call the Outer Banks of North Carolina in early July. These long barrier islands, Barlow admits, he mistook for the mainland, and he assumed, as Verrazano did years before, that North America gave way in the middle to an inland sea. But the men eventually eased their way through the Outer Banks and found a number of islands sheltered between the mainland and these barrier islands. A perfect place to hide a den for privateers, who after all are just sanctioned pirates. They first land on Hatteras Island and formally take possession of the region in the name of Queen Elizabeth. They found the island beautiful, full of game, but without any native population whatsoever. It would be 3 days of isolation until 3 natives appeared and approached the men. The English gave them gifts, and the natives seemed pleased, and then they simply left. Then the next day, a larger group of 40 to 50 native men arrived on the island. Their chief, a man named Granganamio, introduced himself to the English through signs and gestures. He wore a large copper plate on his head to display his status. It's a common myth that the Native Americans lived in the Stone Age. Rather, many of them were on the cusp of the Chalcolithic Age in the 16th century, the Copper Age. Granganamio communicated his friendly intentions, and the English returned with similar gestures. The two groups traded, and Granganamio marveled at the size and craftsmanship of the English vessels. The English tried to ask him what his people called this land. He responded with Wingandakoa, which the English took to be the answer to their question. Scholars believe the English merely heard Granganamio say, "You wear good clothes." As it turns out, Granganamio was a chief among the Secotan natives, and his specific band, the Roanoke, lived on the island that now bears their name. The Secotan and their neighbors were Algonquin or Algonquian-speaking groups, the southern branch of a large linguistic family that includes Pocahontas's people, the Powhatan, and Squanto's people, the Wampanoag. Although, in this dialectical continuum, Granganamio would be strained to understand Powhatan and unable to understand Wampanoag. Granganamio offered 20 deerskins for a tin dish that the English had. They gladly made the trade, and he began to try to figure out how to fasten it to his chest, as he intended to use it as armor. The English found the natives here quite skilled at negotiation and ended up trading away nearly everything they could except for their metal swords, which the Secatan greatly desired. A brother of Granganamio tried to obtain swords for a large container of pearls. The English had to hide their excitement and refuse, acting disinterested in the pearls, so not to reveal the fact that they simply did not trust these natives yet. In the coming days, Granganamio and the English came to know each other better, and eventually the chief brought his wife and kids around to meet the English, a deep sign of trust. The English even took them out on their boats. Eventually, Granganamio invited the English to come visit his home on Roanoke Island. Barlow led a group to visit Roanoke, while Amadas and Fernandez took the ships to continue exploring the coast. Barlow would later write of the Roanoke people,
"A more kind and loving people there cannot be found in the world."
When communication between the two groups became easier, Granganamio, who the English assumed was king of this whole area, introduced a greater chief to them. His name would be Wingina, who the English record as Granganamio's brother, but because of the imperfect communication, could have just as likely been a more distant, maternal relation or just an allied chief. Sometimes kinship terms were used by natives on the East Coast to represent alliances. Wingina was a chief that had some sway over Granganamio and his people on Roanoke, as well as the Secatans on Croatoan Island, of course known as the Croatoans. He also controlled the nearby mainland. The interactions the people of Roanoke had with the English were likely a bit of a test to see if they were suitable enough to be introduced to the wider Secatan world that Wingina was in charge of. And Wingina, while meeting the English, was friendly, but he was far more concerned with matters of his domain and how the English could be of use to him. He told the English that 2 years prior, the chief of the Pamiok, a man named Payamukum, invited a great number of his people to a massive feast, plying them with food and lowering their defenses before falling upon them and slaughtering the majority. He wanted the English to now fight alongside them and avenge the murder of his people. Barlow now suspects that the hospitality of the people of Roanoke had more selfish motives than he initially thought. He writes,
"Whether their persuasion be to the end that they may be revenged of their enemies, or for the love they bear to us, we leave that to the trial thereafter."
Barlow and the English here were in no position to begin participating in native politics, let alone choose sides in an ongoing blood feud. Luckily, Amadas and Fernandez returned from their adventures, where they faced a number of hostile groups and were looking to return to England as soon as possible. Barlow gave 2 Englishmen over to Wingina in return for 2 of the Secatan. A common practice in the day, young men were often given to new groups to learn their language and become a link between the two peoples, as well as insurance for the future return of each party. 2 Secatan men were given over to the English, one named Wanchis, who was of the Roanoke tribe, and another was Manteo, who was the son of the chief of the Croatans. With this, the English depart. The first chapter of their stay in the Roanoke area taking place over about 2 months' time. Once in England, Raleigh had Manteo and Wanchis live with another young man named Thomas Harriot, a brilliant scholar, Oxford graduate, and Raleigh family tutor. Harriot was tasked with learning and recording the Algonquian language and continue teaching Manteo and Wanchis English. Raleigh takes Manteo and Wanchis to meet Queen Elizabeth and present her Barlow's account of the expedition. Raleigh then hires an author by the name of Richard Hakluyt to ghostwrite a book for him entitled Discourse of Western Planting. All of this in anticipation of and in promotion of creating the first English colony in North America, which Raleigh is determined to accomplish. Now, Amadas and Barlow recommended Roanoke Island for a settlement. According to them, Roanoke Island was the ideal place for such a settlement. The natives were friendly, the soil was excellent, there are many useful tree varieties and edible plants. Worthy of note here, Fernandez finds the Chesapeake to the north to be a more promising locale, a place he explored during that 1584 voyage. The Chesapeake was more temperate, a bit easier to navigate, and further away from the Spanish in Florida. Ultimately, Roanoke Island or somewhere close by would be Raleigh's first pick for a colony. Still unable to leave the safety of England, he hires his cousin, Sir Richard Grenville, as admiral of his ships and general over his men. No one on land or sea in this attempt will outrank Grenville. Such was the way of the Western world worked at the time. Grenville's station sat above the rest in terms of his social class. He was, however, an extremely talented privateer and military man and well qualified for the job. And in fact, years before even Sir Humphrey Gilbert's plans, Grenville had a plan to make an English colony in South America. However, a peace between England and Spain at the time scuttled his effort to obtain a charter. Under Grenville, Philip Amadas would be in charge of the ships, and a man named Ralph Lane would be in charge of the soldiers. Raleigh knew Lane from his time in aiding in the colonization of Ireland. Lane's mother was a cousin of Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII, and Lane also served in Queen Elizabeth's household and was a former member of Parliament himself. He was a man used to being respected. And to serve as Raleigh's eyes and ears, Raleigh wanted the previously mentioned Jacques Lemoyne, who was the hired artist for the former French colony. But Lemoyne was simply too old and too settled down to return to the New World. Raleigh's artists, and really the only window that he's going to have into the sights of the New World, would be a man by the name of John White, an artist who accompanied Martin Frobisher on his 1577 voyage. He would now sketch and record their discoveries, and Thomas Harriot, who would survey the land, inspect the minerals of the area and the soils. Simon Fernandez would again serve as pilot. Manteo and Wanchese would return as interpreters. We now have most of our cast. Before departing, Queen Elizabeth knights Raleigh, now Sir Walter Raleigh, and gives him a galleass named the Tiger and 400 pounds of gunpowder, and the title of Lord and Governor of Virginia. The name the English now called the land the Spanish considered part of Florida. All in all, Grenville and company will leave Plymouth, England on April 9th, 1585, with 7 vessels, 600 or so men, and with the hopes and dreams of many in England for the success of their new colony. Now, all of the colonists were men. Half of them were sailors, who were recruited to stay on and help build the initial settlement, but would ultimately leave in preparation of a planned wave of colonist families. There was also an Anglican minister present, and a number of skilled artisans. This colony, I have to say, was planned far better than future Jamestown or Plymouth. At sea, the small fleet, though, is scattered in a storm, their intended rendezvous point being off the southeastern coast of Puerto Rico. Grenville finds he needs to replenish his water and instead ends up landing on the island of St. John's in the Virgin Islands. He lingers here for a bit, building a serviceable fort. He also builds a pinnace to replace one he lost at sea, and he is joined by the Elizabeth, another one of the fleet's ships. The Virgin Islands are small and numerous, and often served as a den for pirates to hide out. The Spanish would post garrisons here and there to sniff out men such as Grenville, and on May 16th, 1585, they first spot the English in their small fort. 5 days later, 20 Spanish horsemen appear outside of the fort, and they signal that they wish to parley. Grenville meets them with 20 soldiers and 2 horsemen of his own. The Spanish condemn the English presence on the island, but Grenville tells them that he was simply here to get water and to trade. The Spanish agree to meet the next day and perhaps see what trades could be made. Grenville arrived at the meeting spot as planned, but the Spanish did not. Sometimes the unknown is the most frightening. Grenville doesn't like this and immediately rushes back to the fort, relieved that the Spanish had not yet attacked. He orders everyone to the boats and abandons the fort, carving a secret message in English but in Gothic letters for the others of the fleet that may happen to come by reporting the bare facts of their presence there. The Spanish will eventually translate the message and report it to Havana. Lastly, he sets the woods on fire on St. John's Island, and he sails westwards, dropping the crew of the Spanish ships he earlier seized off on the island of Hispaniola at the settlement of La Isabela. Grenville's fleet, even divided, was overwhelmingly powerful compared to the small Spanish settlement. The Spanish here made the wise choice to trade with the English, and reportedly, the two groups held a party that featured bullfighting. Grenville told the local governor that he intended to settle on an island and live at peace with Spain. After this, they depart for Roanoke. The ships under the command of Thomas Cavendish separated from Grenville early on. He spends this time trading with the natives and capturing Spanish ships off the coast of Florida. Another ship of the fleet, named the Red Lion under the command of Captain Raymond, ended up off the coast of Jamaica. Raymond leaves all 20 soldiers from his ship on the island. The reasons aren't exactly clear, and continues on towards Roanoke. Only 2 of these poor souls would survive their time in Jamaica, and even those 2 survivors were then captured by the Spanish. The Red Lion and another ship named the Dorothy under Barlow's command make better time than Grenville, and they arrive at the Outer Banks. They place 30 men on Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras Island, and then they abandon the Roanoke project for Newfoundland to plunder the Portuguese and Spanish fishing operations there. Grenville, with the rest of the ships, arrives several days later, and they run the ship the Tiger, the ship gifted by the Queen, aground while trying to cross the Outer Banks. Although this ship will be repaired, it contained much of the food for the new colony, and most of that was now lost. The English were not off to a great start. Grenville and Ralph Lane establish a base on Roanoke Island. They recover the men from the island of Croatoa, then they tour the nearby villages, the first being the village of Pamiawak, where John White creates his first drawings of the New World and its people, his artwork being of great value to historians today. Grenville writes that this country
is not excelled by any other whatsoever.
And John White himself falls in love with the area. Of course, he will go on to be the governor of the lost colony of Roanoke and the grandfather of Virginia Dare. That story has its origin here in 1585. As much as the English were interested in this area, the natives took interest in the new people and their possessions. At the village named Aquascocock, a small silver cup owned by the English went missing. Once its absence was noticed, Grenville returned to the village, where the natives ran away. The men then burned down the village and the fields and left. On this tour, the English travel about 200 miles round trip before returning to Roanoke Island. Those taking the soundings of the nearby waters concluded that much of the shore here was simply too shallow for larger vessels, and those sent about the land reported no signs of gold or silver. While the land still held much beauty, there are reasons to consider further exploration before settling down. But in late July, Chief Granganamio of Roanoke, through an interpreter, Manteo, meets with Sir Grenville, praises him for burning the village of his enemies, the Aquascocock, and invites him to settle down at the north end of Roanoke Island. Shortly thereafter, the English meet with Wingina, who again is somewhat paramount over his brother, and confirms his permission for the English to settle on the island. John White makes a sketch often labeled as that of Wingina. They then also meet Wingina's father, an elder named Ensenor, who very much enjoyed the novelty of the English people. At this point, Sir Grenville wished to leave and further hunt for Spanish ships. General Ralph Lane would now be installed as governor of the young colony. Lane had developed a low opinion of Grenville. His actions in the Caribbean gave full alarm to the Spanish that the English were now out to make a colony, and his burning of the native village many felt was an overreaction, creating nothing but ill will. Nevertheless, Grenville fulfilled Raleigh's orders and made Lane governor, and yielded his naval power to Philip Amadas, who Raleigh named Admiral of Virginia. He would also serve as lieutenant governor of the colony. Such title for Amadas meant little, having command of just 3 small ships, a pinnace, and 2 even smaller river sloops, as the larger vessels would be leaving with Grenville, as the loss of most of the provisions meant that Grenville could not leave 300 or so men on Roanoke as planned. Rather, he leaves a mere 100 or so men under Lane and Amadas, and orders the remaining 500 or so to leave on the departing ships. And with this, most of the colonists trickle out of the colony by the end of September of 1585. including John White, who will return to England to walk Sir Walter Raleigh through this world they called Virginia. His pictures and eventually engravings based on his artwork still fill our history books today. By the time the bulk of the colonists had left, they had constructed a temporary shelter, and from here a chapel, a few houses, and there's some evidence they even made bricks from the local clays. There were livestock pens, a defensive fortification, ditches made, and earthworks. The one thing the colonists did not have the opportunity to undertake was the planting of crops, as it was far too late in the year to expect a harvest. But Governor Lane finds what he calls guinea wheat that the natives have to be a suitable staple for the English. We call this maize or corn, and he notes that the natives here very much desired English cloth. The colony could now feed itself well if it had enough fabrics to trade. In September of 1585, Governor Lane formally moves from Port Ferdinando, the lookout station on Hatteras Island, and takes up residency on the island of Roanoke in his new colony. His watchers at Port Ferdinando will look out and wait for a planned resupply fleet, not knowing that this fleet was redirected to Newfoundland. Governor Lane himself looked more towards the mainland and planned to follow up on rumors of gold and silver high up in the mountains. Grenville, on his return voyage, captures a cargo ship by the name of Santa Maria di San Vicente. The cargo from this one ship alone made the entire effort profitable, and above everything else that happened up to this point, even settling Roanoke, the taking of the San Vicente was the headline news when he returned to England. Back in the Roanoke colony, the men began brewing beer. The natives are more than willing to trade for their corn, and Chief Wingina even attends an Anglican church service. Governor Lane sends Amadas with a few men to explore the Chesapeake to the north to confirm Simon Fernandez's observations. All seemed well until fall came, and then the local natives all fell ill to a mysterious disease, such that they have never experienced before. Those closest to the English seem to have been the first affected, and the natives took notice, blaming the English for the disease. Worse yet, Chief Granganamio, the oldest and most generous ally of the English, now dies from the disease. The great Chief Wingina, now holding council, will have one less pro-English voice in his ear. Wingina himself, as the English ran low on goods to trade for food, grew tired of the English, who again refused to send men to help Wingina on the warpath. Furthermore, the English being the source of the disease, it was at least possible in the native view that the English were intentionally conjuring the illness. In the native fashion, the English were no true allies to Wingina anymore. The English note here that the interpreter Manteo remained a steadfast friend, whereas Wanchese visited less and less frequently. The situation here may have been alleviated had the resupply ships arrived as planned. Or, had the English known that the redirection had happened, they would have doled out their goods in a more conservative fashion. Instead, they traded away most everything in expectation of more supplies before the end of the year 1585. Around this time, the English noted that Wingina had changed his name to Pimisapan, meaning likely, one who watches closely. Now, Algonquian people change their names throughout their lives as they mature into adulthood, obtain status, or preparing to go to war, and shed their civil identity for that of a warrior. The English have no awareness of any of these traditions. Come the spring, the men who went north returned, having stayed with the Chesapeake natives all winter. They reported that in every way the Chesapeake was superior to the Roanoke area. Governor Lane developed the opinion that the entire colony should be relocated there given the opportunity. But before moving the colony, he decided he would lead his own expedition to the mainland and search for gold. Furthermore, Pimnisapan informed Governor Lane that Chief Menatonan of the Chowanoks was gathering allies to kill off all of the English. Lane decided to travel directly to the village of Menatonan, taking about 60 men with him, including Manteo and Thomas Harriot, in March of 1586. They take the Chowanoks completely by surprise. They seize Chief Menatonan. Far from being on the warpath, the chief seemed impossibly old, and the English describe him as being impotent in his limbs. The chief claims that the English were tricked, and it was Penisipan who planned to attack the English. Indeed, Harriet observes that the Choanoks had as many as 600 warriors, but there existed no signs that they were preparing for war. Scholars believe Penisipan sought to have the English attack an enemy for him, or perhaps, considering both parties to now be enemies, sought to turn one against the other. Lane then asked the chief where he could find gold. The chief, through Manteo, told him of a land in the west named Chaunis, Tamayoatan, that lay on a great sea where flakes of gold could be gathered in the streams. It is possible that Menetanen did not mean to be deceptive here. The English did not use the term gold to speak with the chief, but rather the Algonquian word wasador, which at the time referred to any sort of yellowish metal. It is likely Menetanen here was referring to the native copper that could be found around the Great Lakes. And one of those lakes would be the sea that he mentioned. Now Governor Lane is intrigued by these stories, but now has reason to be distrustful of the natives. He takes the chief's son, a man named Skyku, as collateral, and he returns to the Roanoke Colony. Here he keeps Skyku, and then quickly departs with a smaller party of 40 men, seeking to sail up the Roanoke River in search of Chaunis Tamayotan. And I know I'm saying that in various ways. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. Food running very low, Lane could only provide enough provisions to feed his men for a few days, counting on new native groups that they would encounter with providing food. But for 3 days, Lane and his men saw no other people. It was as if Penisipan had warned these groups to stay away and let the English starve. Then one evening, as the English were just about to land and prepare camp for the night, a chant began to ring out from the woods, seemingly in every direction. The men heard the name Manteo, 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 chanted over and over again. Somehow these unseen people knew the name of their native interpreter. Imagine the sudden fear the English must have felt. Now imagine the fear that Manteo must have felt in this situation. Then, arrows began to rain down upon their boats. Governor Lane quickly did an about-face and sought to flee back to Roanoke, which they managed to do, sustaining themselves on their dogs. Yes, they had to eat their dogs. Penisipan must have been shocked by their safe return, but outwardly towards the English he remained somewhat friendly. But it is around this time that Penisipan's father, Ensenor, dies, likely the last pro-English voice in Wingina's council, now Penisipan's council. Penisipan no longer had any opposition among his advisors towards a more direct act of aggression upon the English. Governor Lane at this point, perhaps understandably, becomes extremely suspicious of all the natives except for trusting Manteo, realizing above all, the English simply do not understand who is in league with who and who intends to do the English harm. The anthropologist Frederick Leach writes of Lane's account at this point,
These have almost the quality of paranoid ravings.
But to be generous here, there were reasons to question whether or not the English were being lured into traps. Governor Lane then decides to interrogate Skyku, whose father, after all, seemingly sent the English on their trip up the Roanoke River and directly into a trap. Skyku reiterates what his father had told Lane, that Penisipan is indeed gathering warriors to wipe out the English. Skyku then tries to escape Roanoke Island, but is captured and placed into chains. Governor Lane tells him that if he tries to escape again, he will cut off his head. Then, cooling down a bit, Governor Lane decides to deliver Skyku not back to his father, but to Penisipan. A curious move. This was perhaps done to test Penisipan and Menetanen, who outwardly to the English appeared to be enemies. Should Skyku end up in one piece back with his father, it would be quite telling. But shockingly, towards the end of May 1586, Skyku flees from Penisipan and appears back on Roanoke Island. Skyku claims that Penisipan treated him worse than Governor Lane, and that now he knew more details of Penisipan's plan. He was going to lure Governor Lane out of the fortified settlement of Roanoke and have him murdered, before picking off the rest, now leaderless. Skyku claimed that the planned massacre was to occur on the night of the next new moon, which the English reckoned on their calendar to be June 10th. Governor Lane is now in a very difficult position. With little food left, he already had a number of his men living on nearby islands, fending for themselves or relying on the charity of the natives. As such, he only had about 50 fighting men still left at his immediate disposal. Lane, still feigning friendliness with Pemisipan, informs him that he will be leaving the Roanoke settlement to await the arrival of an English fleet. The intention here is to convince Pemisipan Lane will not be in the colony for a bit, so would not serve as a threat, but also convince Pemisipan that more English would be arriving soon. Therefore, Pemisipan should not try to become a threat himself. All lies, of course. Rather, on the night of July 1st, 1586, Governor Lane leads his men out of the fortified settlement on Roanoke Island and drives the local tribe of Secotans, the Roanokes themselves, off their own island. He then quickly travels to Pemisipan's village, where Pemisipan greets Lane, not knowing of the attack on the Roanokes. Lane gets real close to him and then screams, "Christ, our victory!" signaling the English to attack. Philip Amadas manages to shoot Pemisipan. Wounded, but still strong, Pemisipan flees into the woods, but is killed by another man by the name of Edward Nugent, who cuts off Pemisipan's head and gives it to Governor Lane as a trophy that he will display on a pike back at the Roanoke Colony. A quick and vicious victory that nonetheless likely permanently damaged the relations that the English would have with the natives in the Roanoke region. Fortunately for Governor Lane, he would not have to live through any of the consequences of his actions here, as shortly after the attack, the fleet of Sir Francis Drake is spotted at the lookout station of Port Ferdinando. Drake was a close cousin of Sir Richard Grenville, and Grenville again was a cousin of Sir Walter Raleigh, all three being West Countrymen, the group of colonizers, explorers, and privateers previously mentioned at the top of this episode. Drake had arrived at Roanoke after attacking the settlement of Spanish Cartagena and then St. Augustine, among other places, with massive success, freeing over 1,000 European galley slaves, and his fleet was now full of looted goods, food, weapons, as well as a large number of enslaved Africans. It is believed Drake let these individuals go on the mainland near Roanoke because there is no accounting for them after this time. Ultimately, nobody knows if this is indeed true, and if this is true, how those poor souls fared among the natives. Hopefully well, again, nobody can be sure. But we know here that Drake suddenly had the room because of his following offer to Governor Lane. Drake, seeing the plight of the English at Roanoke, offers to either evacuate the colony or provide supplies so that the colony can continue on. Governor Lane decides to accept the supplies and relocate the colony to the Chesapeake. Sir Drake approves and gives the governor 2 pinnaces, 1 bark, 4 smaller boats, and a massive amount of provisions. However, just as these new supplies were being transported, a massive hurricane came through the area. Such a storm Governor Lane had never experienced before, and the supplies were scattered by the storm, ruined all of them. Governor Lane had a sudden change of heart, and he wanted to return to England. Lane evacuates the entire colony, including Manteo, except for 3 unfortunate men who were off on an expedition. He would not wait for them. Everyone else left with Drake's fleet, and when they arrived in England, the news of Drake's massive successes against the Spanish overshadowed Governor Lane's failed Roanoke colony, for which he had only brought a few plant samples to show for all of his efforts. Meanwhile, a few weeks after the abandonment of Roanoke, Sir Richard Grenville finally arrives with resupply. Shocked, he finds no one in the colony, except for the body of a single dead Englishman and a single dead native hanging from a tree. He quickly sought out the Roanoke tribe, for which he knew to be so friendly, and they too, of course, were missing. Sir Grenville captures a native along the coast who tells him that Governor Lane left with everyone some weeks ago. This left Grenville in an odd position. With his resupply, he also brought several hundred colonists to further grow the colony. The people were to supplement a pre-existing colony under Governor Lane. They were in no position to restart the colony of Roanoke themselves, and Grenville was not resigned to leave these people here to suffer the same hardships that had led Lane to abandon the colony, whatever they may be. At the same time, if he did not leave anyone here, he would void Raleigh's claim. so he decided to leave 15 soldiers at the fort on Roanoke. He gave them 4 cannons and 2 years' worth of provisions. A year later, the artist John White arrived with his colonists and Manteo to restart the Roanoke Colony. This time, he would be governor. From his short time in the Roanoke area in 1585, he gained a rather idyllic view of how the English and the Secatan people would be able to coexist. He was shocked to find the fort at Roanoke empty, except for the bones of a single man. White would come to learn from the Croatoans that a native coalition waited for the soldiers of the fort to let down their guards, and when the soldiers fell into the habit of spreading out over Roanoke Island to fish for oysters, the natives murdered most of them. The rest fled to Port Ferdinando and were never seen again. It would appear that the Croatoans were the only sure friends the English had left in the Roanoke area. It would be the choices made by the first colony of Roanoke that established Manteo's people, the Croatoans, as the safe haven for the colonists of the second colony of Roanoke, and now the infamously lost colony of Roanoke. Now for some less obvious and perhaps indirect legacies of the first Roanoke colony. Sir Walter Raleigh had John White's map of this first land of Virginia combined with Jacques Lemoyne's map of French Florida, and came to see the rumors of gold in the mountains of Appalachia that Lemoyne recorded, and the one of his own people recording gold in the land of Chanis-Tamoatan as one and the same. Raleigh, after the failed Roanoke and the lost Roanoke, will continue to hold on to his claim to North America, preventing other Englishmen from making any attempts at colonization, but without undertaking another attempt of his own. In this way, he actually now stalled the spread of the English over the North American continent. In 1603, Sir Humphrey Gilbert's son and Raleigh's nephew, Bartholomew Gilbert, made an unauthorized trip to the New World with a man named Bartholomew Gosnold. One of their objectives was to search for the lost colonists. The men ended up making a short-lived colony off the coast of New England and returned only to be sued by Sir Walter Raleigh for violating his charter. However, with the passing of Queen Elizabeth, those around Raleigh found his charter to be quite vulnerable and likely already invalid. It would be Richard Hawkloyd, Raleigh's former employee, who wrote the book promoting the first Roanoke colony, who would help to develop the legal case for the invalidation of Raleigh's charter, and the petition for the new bifurcated Virginia Company to assume the rights to North America. He and Gosnold would become investors in the Virginia Company of London, responsible for the Jamestown settlement in the very same area the colonists from the first Roanoke colony suggested, the Chesapeake. And then another one of Sir Humphrey Gilbert's sons, Raleigh Gilbert, and a distant relative named Sir Ferdinando Gorges, were part of the Virginia Company of Plymouth, responsible for the failed Popham colony. Eventually changing their name to the Council for New England, they sanctioned the settlement of the Plymouth colony. The failures you have now have strange implications for the deep future. Please tune in next time as we see how the Spanish are recovering in Florida after Drake's attack. This has been the Other States of America History Podcast. I'm Eric Yanis. Thank you for listening.